The Ukrainian soldier approached slowly after the drone alerted him to the presence of Russians in the trench. Povo. He prepared to throw the grenade in a move that could solve the whole problem. In that dangerous attack where the odds were not in his favor. In another trench system, the Ukrainians ran when Russian artillery began to systematically bombard their shelters. Russian assaults intensified in the direction of Toretsk, with all kinds of equipment being used, from tanks to electric scooters. Ukrainian drones surrounded the Russians in their hideouts, preparing to dive, while soldiers tried to shoot them down. The fighting in the trenches filled the air with the smell of gunpowder. The shouts of the soldiers, trying to coordinate, mixed with the crack of gunfire. The battle for Toretsk had complicated phases for both sides. The Russians had been close to the city since the beginning of the conflicts in 2014 when Orlivka was taken. Since then, the villages have lived with the proximity of the conflict and the shadow of war hanging over them. In June 2024, the fighting intensified, and New York were among the first places threatened by Kremlin forces. By August, Pivinicini was already completely taken, while New York received reinforcements from the 12th Special Forces Brigade. To break the siege of Ukrainian troops in a city almost completely taken by the Russians, on the Pivinicini side, special forces were mobilized to buy time. The Omega Group was assigned to fight in the region. They advanced through the forests until they reached strategic positions from where the Russians were sending information and preparing for the arrival of reinforcements. They were dangerous marches through forests, villages, and ruined buildings, with the destruction of Ukraine right before their eyes. Originally, that detachment of the Ukrainian National Guard Special Forces was trained for anti-terror and protection missions. Now, it had become a unit specialized in combat operations, ambushes, tactical assaults, and reconnaissance in hostile territory. Their grenades exploded in the rooms they needed to clear of Russian presence. The Western standard rifles fired as soon as their barrels crossed the doors. The attack on the trenches put the Ukrainian operators up against heavily entrenched Russians in newly dug positions. The advances were covered by bursts of fire that sparked during those tense days of combat. With each shot, the sturdy rifles pushed their stocks against the soldiers' shoulders as the bullets traveled from the barrels into enemy bodies. The support from the armored vehicles provided crucial protection in exposed areas where the Russians, sheltered in their trenches, had a clear line of fire over the flat terrain, an advantage they used to hold back the Ukrainian advance. Even so, the soldiers advanced in formation, using suppression tactics to neutralize the resistance. The RPGs delivered precise strikes, their explosions lighting up the Russian defenses in fleeting flashes. At night, the drones of the 28th Brigade hunted Russian targets. Their thermal cameras picked up the heat of enemy bodies, thermal signatures that were overshadowed by the sudden glare of explosions. But all of this was just a stopgap against the growing pressure of Kremlin troops on Toretsk.
The Russians kept advancing,
Within a few days, their first units were already stepping into the suburbs of Toretsk. The relentless pursuit by drones mapped every movement of the Ukrainian defenses. In the trenches, the soldiers moved about like ants under fire, tormented by the explosions of Russian artillery, which forced them into improvised shelters. The new shelters offered fragile hope against the deluge of steel that sought to tear them from life. Every moment of despair was meticulously captured by Russian lenses, while the batteries and artillery patiently awaited the coordinates for the next attack. The detonations hammered the hideouts until the last defenders were driven out. Now, hostages in a game of cat and mouse, forced to feverishly search for new corners of the trench. Other sectors of the defensive system also collapsed under bombardments. Soldiers, deafened by the continuous thunder, crawled to help the wounded. They even felt a morbid relief when a Russian miscalculation sent the shells away. Even in those rare pauses, staying down was a matter of life or death in Sia. A single stray piece of shrapnel could tear a man apart from 50 meters away. On August 23, 2024, the Russians already had fixed positions in the city. They were now waiting for the advance of the groups in the south. There, one of the commanders, Mykola, was facing a challenge with his soldiers. Mykola Volodymyrovich was in command of one of the assault groups in New York. It was ironic how he ended up there. Mobilized in 2022, he saw an opportunity in the armed forces. After serving his sentence in 2015, civilian life didn't offer him many options. Born in the Russian city of Donetsk in 1989, was even in the average age range of current Russian soldiers. Unlike when he arrived in 2022, when there were many younger soldiers. He has survived since then and now commands the men of the Penal Battalion within the 9th Brigade. It was this group of misfit or criminal soldiers who preferred war to prison that Mykola ordered to get ready. The Russians sent more men against New York. Mykola knew that those damned Azov were there. That gave more impetus to many of the soldiers under the armored vehicles. All of them eagerly coveted the chance to kill or capture one of those Ukrainians who were portrayed as monsters in Russian war propaganda. The command ordered them to send everything they could in that assault. Some groups went on ATVs. Others were in Desert Cross Mule, Chinese vehicles for any kind of terrain. They offered little protection against the drones. The smarter soldiers jumped out when they saw the kamikazes diving in to spread death. The terror made one of the all-terrain vehicle drivers lose control. Still dizzy, the Russians heard the cluster bombs exploding around them, releasing their small metal spheres that took the soldiers' lives. The survivors scattered throughout the village. Some were luckier to be protected by the metal of the infantry transports. The armor withstood the first blast. They arrived in a village covered in smoke. Moro sent a large group. This time, more than a dozen men got out of the armored vehicle. The transport couldn't escape before one of the kamikazes put an end to its activities. The Russian soldiers organized themselves among the ruins and communicated to get the squads into position. Their emotions ranged from fear to a sense of victory when they saw a kamikaze and blew it up before it could harm them. But the 12th Azov Brigade had much more to throw against Russia's 9th Motorized Rifle Brigade. More cluster bombs exploded over a wide area, while the kamikazes searched for more specific targets. Some bodies were already visible at the beginning of this attack. Other Russians saved their lives by finding stronger shelters. The kamikazes looked for them in those places. If they didn't blow up their lives, at least they demolished the hideout. Their success was marked by the corpses of Moscow's men displayed as trophies in the drone footage. The explosions died down until more bodies arrived to be burned by the Ukrainian fungus. Some invaders appeared riding electric scooters, a tactical mobility advantage that turned out to be a deadly trap. Although fast, they became easy targets for Ukrainian drones or any sniper hiding in the ruins. During the advance, a Russian soldier fell on the rough terrain, but managed to get up in time to rejoin the platoon that infiltrated the village. The fighters hurriedly took cover under heavy fire. The less fortunate, who couldn't find shelter, crawled wounded from the previous bombardments. Tish. Among them, one soldier decided to confront the drone. He lay on the ground and fired, imitating the tactic that others had tried before. Maybe this time it would work. The drone made a sharp turn, gaining speed like a falcon, diving down on its prey. The desperate attempt to escape was useless. In seconds, it became yet another victim of the electronic demon that ruled the skies over Ukraine. The quad bike transports were fast. They operated in various parts of the front for lightning attacks, which put the Russians inside the trenches. When they were spotted by the kamikazes, they had to deal with the explosions. The men who arrived at the trench in those vehicles didn't find any Ukrainians. The area had already been lost by Kyiv, and now what mattered was breaking the siege and withdrawing the troops. Still in New York, the Russians had to survive the drone attack in order to occupy the position and move forward, to finally take the village. The explosions reduced their numbers. The work was difficult, increasingly complicated. When the kamikaze hunt ended and only torn flesh was left in the trench, the Russian BMP brought more soldiers. The men got out. The vehicle drove to the river, Toretsk. It stopped over the water just as the cluster bombs exploded over the trench. The soldiers who arrived met the same fate in the trench. Mykola was tired of sending so many to their deaths. He joined his men in one of the waves. Since 2022, he had endured Ukrainian artillery during the advances. When he was promoted to lieutenant, it was because of the experience from those 2 years enduring bombs overhead. He made the men move quickly. He didn't want to leave anyone exposed. The explosions took the lives of some, and Mykola made the others move again. They ran to find new cover. The lieutenant knew they might be under observation by drones, which would reveal their positions for another kamikaze attack or artillery strike. What he didn't expect was the presence of soldiers who fired their rifles at the Russians as they ran. Some of the men fell to the ground, not knowing what had suddenly drained the strength from their bodies. Others rolled as they were shot. The survivors were captured by the Ukrainians. Mykola was one of them. He didn't even know that. Meanwhile, the troops from his brigade kept going. Russian drones dropped their grenades on the last Ukrainian defenses on the northern edges of the city. The unmanned aerial vehicle teams of Russia's 9th Brigade were very active in New York. The air saturated with so many infernal machines affected the Ukrainian retreat. The organization was complicated with so many attacks ending up hindering the rescue of surrounded troops. Many armored vehicles were destroyed while still on their way to their hideouts. The loss of men was difficult, but the 12th Brigade of Ukraine managed to accomplish part of its objective to break the Russian siege that threatened the lives of so many soldiers. They retreated shortly after, watching from afar as the Russian wave took over New York. Thus, in October, the Russians were already stepping into Toretsk, starting close combat with the Ukrainians, to the point where both sides could hear up close the blast of the ammunition that would kill them. The drones scouted Toretsk's defenses, searching for enemies to be targeted by the artillery. They followed the armored vehicles and other troop transports until they discovered the trenches. The artillery locked in the coordinates. Moments later, columns of smoke marked death and terror. Over those defenses, the Russians had a lot to throw against the Ukrainians. The D-howitzers, 20 of them, were fired at regular intervals to keep the Kiev troops under threat. Anti-tank guided missile teams roamed the clear tree lines, prepared their instruments, and guided the missiles against the Ukrainian defenses around Toretsk. These missiles flew considerable distances, spinning in the air. The warhead, weighing almost 2 kilograms, exploded, sending out a shock wave and fragments that could kill soldiers more than 20 meters from the blast area. Tree lines were regions of intense combat. They used to be windbreak curtains, serving as barriers against the strong, dry winds that swept across the plains. In this way, they prevented wind erosion. Now, they were the soldiers' protection. Men from the Loot Brigade fired anti-tank 4S at the advancing Russians. Then, they had to run through the dense vegetation until they finally reached one of the villages. They hid from enemy attacks there. Any noise was checked with a grenade to end the situation. As a special operations unit of the National Police deployed in Toretsk, the Loot Brigade used its weaponry to the operational limit. High rate of fire, ammunition consumption pushed to the limit to stay in the fight, and use of all available systems to make life hell for the Russians. Each building was taken with grenades, each forest swept by anti-tank 4 rockets. They were quick in combat, stopping only to recover their energy or to take care of the wounded. At the same time, they passed by the bodies of their enemies, collecting their war trophies. These close combats required a level of risk that wasn't for everyone. Assisted by an observation drone, 3 Ukrainians managed to enter a Russian trench. They received information about 2 enemies positioned at one of the bends in the defense system. One of the soldiers from the 32nd Ukrainian Brigade moved ahead. He saw the 2 enemies so close that he could gauge the tension on their faces. It even seemed like an advantage, but 3 against 2 defenders wasn't such a good probability in that style of combat. The Ukrainian threw the grenade and watched the explosion engulf the Russians. The dust blinded him for a few moments. The Ukrainian tried to confirm the kills. However, what he saw was the pair moving and coughing. Dazed, they didn't even manage to fight back. The Ukrainian took advantage of the situation to walk slowly through the trench. He took cover in the pauses between steps, which brought him almost face to face with the enemy. He saw the 2 moving behind the defenses. He threw another grenade at the pair, and it exploded almost right in front of their faces. They ducked down, feeling the shrapnel hitting their helmets. The Ukrainian came back to deliver more torment, now with his rifle spitting out pieces of death at the Russians. Their blood was already running on the ground. Breathing was difficult. The next grenade filled their lungs with dust and smoke. The last time they breathed the air of war in their lives. Sometimes, these trenches were very close to houses in villages or in the suburbs of cities. While it was safer for soldiers to protect themselves, it also made assaults harder. The Ukrainians had to proceed carefully, calculating how to use grenades to clear the way. The thrown explosives made arcs in the air until they landed on the Russian defenses, while weapons were reloaded to start the direct violence. The pulled triggers set fire inside the enemy defenses. It was important to keep constant fire at the entrance of the trench. Since the grenades had forced the bears into the shelters, the rifles could aim into the darkness. The gunfire ended the resistance. Having taken that position, the soldiers were not safe. It was time to go back. Under artillery fire, the Ukrainians saw the explosions up close. Even if the bombs didn't explode right on top of them, the shrapnel spinning through the air tore into the flesh of many, assisting the wounded made retreat harder. This delay made it easier for the Russian artillery to take the lives of the Ukrainians. Extraction wasn't much better for those who tried to use the armored vehicles. The drones were there to hunt the machines through the streets of Toretsk. Some of those flying devices were loaded with explosives so heavy that they bent the metal of the armored vehicles until the fire licked the soldier's skin. Yet, these attacks prevented the Ukrainians from moving in several parts of Toretsk. The Russians were able to move easily, hunting down enemy defenses. The ruins where the Ukrainians tried to set up their defenses quickly turned into graves. The Russian kamikazes hunted everything that moved inside Toretsk. The flight area of the electronic demons was an extremely dangerous zone for any troops trying to enter or leave the city. Everything was a target. There were a lot of images of the Ukrainian resistance in close combat, more than there were images of the Russians, but that couldn't overshadow how powerful the Kremlin's artillery and drones were, which allowed more than half of Toretsk to already be under their control. By the end of November 2024, the Russian offensive in Donetsk continued at its steady pace. But that pace came at a high price. The casualties kept increasing. From mid-July, at the fall of Pivitini, until the end of November, Kremlin troops advanced about 4 kilometers. It was about 1 kilometer per month in a fierce battle for Toretsk, a short distance filled with corpses and ruins.